So the title of my presentation was Fatigue Risk Management Approaches. And when I initially made that title, I meant approaches meaning methods and things you can do to address fatigue risk management. But I think now that I've had some time to think about it, it's fatigue risk management approaches. It's coming. Business aviation in Canada is exempt or outside of the CARs, but it's coming. In the United States, business aviation's regulated by Part 91 in the Code of Federal Regulations, and they too are outside of fatigue risk management presently. Yet, we work with over 100 business aviation organizations in the U.S. because just because you're allowed to work too much and operate in a manner that's fatigued doesn't mean it's a great idea. And sometimes I make the analogy that in the United States, we have the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and they set limits on certain things. One of the things they regulate is the amount of lead you can have in the water. And the limit is 15 parts per million. And if I gave you 2 glasses of water, and I said this one has 14 parts per million, compliant, perfectly legal water, and this one is, Fiji water, who's drinking the lead water? And so just because something's compliant doesn't mean it's a good idea. And moreover, the more that the industry, business aviation industry, regulates itself, the less ire it's going to attract from the regulator. And so we strongly encourage taking this on as an issue and taking it on in earnest and self-regulating. And by doing so, you determine your own fate rather than waiting for the regulator to come down with a heavy hand and dictate how things are going to happen. When we talk about fatigue risk management, we're talking about something that's based on a hard science. And that wasn't always the case. That was 20 years ago, fatigue risk management and the whole field of fatigue was not a hard science. It was a soft science based on self-report and subjective measures. So if you have a subjective measure, it's hard to investigate the biology and the scientific basis of how people are able to behave and be alert on their jobs. And that's the way it works. Psychologists would do experiments and say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how tired are you right now? You'd say, I'm at 7. And then they would ask another person, on a scale of 1 to 10, how tired are you right now? And they would say, I'm at 4. Well, what's one person's 4? What's the meaning of that 4 to someone else's 7? It's a subjective measure. It would be like going to the doctor and the doctor saying, we're going to do a full physical. We're going to start with your cholesterol. On a scale of 1 to 10, how do you feel about your cholesterol? You'd say, 4. I said, okay, I'm going to write that in your chart. We'll see you in 6 months. It wouldn't be very useful. And that's where the field of fatigue science was. This study was done to look at the phenomenon of sleep debt. And at the time, the theoretical argument was sleep debt is a real thing. You accumulate sleep debt. Each day you don't have adequate sleep. But the predominant belief among scientists and in the operational community was that 10 years on the job, your brain adapts. It rewires itself. It learns to live on restricted sleep because people work shift work and people work in these environments, and eventually you just get used to it. You get a call on the phone or you respond to an ad and they say, do you want to participate in a science experiment? And you say, yeah, sure, what's it about? And they say, well, you come and you live in the hospital for 3 weeks. You're not allowed to leave. So this is amazing that people volunteer to do this. And these are healthy adults aged 20 through 59. So healthy adults aged 20 through 59 volunteer to come and live in the hospital. And when they arrive, we glue electrodes to their heads to measure their brain activity and measure their sleep. We have ECG to measure their heart that they wear continuously. We insert a catheter into their vein and we pump a picoliter of blood every 15 minutes for 3 weeks. Every 15 minutes, just a drop of blood. And we're measuring hormones and stress factors. And the first reason why this study is famous is because this is a hard, objective measure. This is a accurate quantity indicating somebody's alertness. And this was, the PVT was invented in the early 80s, but this was the study that really showed its sensitivity and utility in quantifying alertness. And what's shown on that vertical scale, these are lapses of attention in the PVT. And what it's measuring are microsleeps. That is, the brain goes from being awake to being asleep to being awake again in half a second or longer. They happen without warning, and you're usually unaware that it's occurred. Your eyes are open. You could be walking, talking, flying, doing your job, but your brain's gone for half a second. And we can measure them with the PVT. And what it's showing is wake state instability. That is, your alertness is not reliable. And operationally, they're correlated with errors of omission. I skipped a step. I missed something. Driving, I didn't see the brake lights. A famous one is American Airlines 1420, a crash that happened in Little Rock. And the pilot failed to arm the spoiler. And Little Rock's a short runway, and they were going too fast, increased reverse thrust and exceeded parameters, and lost control of the plane, and the plane went sideways and then hit a lighting structure and cut the plane in half, and there were several fatalities, and it was a big accident. But what was the mistake made? I failed to arm the spoilers. This is something I did 7,000 times correctly. This is not unique. I just missed a step. And this is exactly the manifestation of an error of omission associated with a lapse. You have a lapse of attention, and you go on to the next step, and you missed a step. And that's how we see the errors manifest. We also see another mode of errors manifesting due to fatigue, and that's impulsivity, errors of commission. And an error of commission is, I pushed the button and I didn't mean to. That is, when the first response to fatigue is, I'm just going to try harder. I'm going to overcome fatigue with willpower. And then we see impulsivity. You become impulsive. If you've seen the movie Apollo 13, so Apollo 13, they didn't ever explicitly mention it, but there's 3 or 4 cues in the movie where they indicate the level of sleep deprivation that crew experienced. Tom Hanks is struggling with simple arithmetic, and he has to sort of admit that he can't do math. But there's another part of the movie where Kevin Bacon is piloting the spacecraft, and Tom Hanks floats up and checks in with him. He says, oh, what's he doing? Oh, I'm doing this. And he said, oh, what's that? And there's a piece of tape over a button. He said, oh, that's the button that jettisons the part of the aircraft that you guys are in presently. And I'm getting a bit punchy, and I didn't want to shoot you guys out into space accidentally. And Tom Hanks says, good idea, with the tape. And that's an impulsive error. I'm fatigued, I'm impaired, I just pushed the button. It's an undoable event. I've committed to it, and now we're in big trouble. And we see those types of errors, compensatory response errors. Is the group getting 6 hours? Why is it interesting? Because I live on 6 hours of sleep during the work week. In fact, I got in late yesterday evening, and I got to bed at 3 a.m. And I set my alarm and woke this morning at 9 a.m. I got exactly 6 hours of sleep last night. And so 6 hours of sleep for pilots and operational folks and people working shift work is not exotic. Even after 13 days of getting 6 hours of sleep, the next day when you get 6 hours of sleep, you still get worse. It just keeps getting worse. And so this is data that really ended the debate. Sleep debt is a real thing. The only way to recover from sleep debt is by getting the sleep you need and some recovery sleep to pay off the debt. It's like you get to the credit card company, you accumulate it, and the only way to get rid of it is to pay it off. And so with sleep debt, caffeine and other stimulants, they'll upregulate you and make you more alert for the period of time that the drug is acting in your system. By the way, caffeine's a drug. While the drug's in your system and acting on you, it will upregulate you. But when the drug wears off, you're right back to where you started on this line, and the only way to recover is to sleep. So reason number 2 is sleep debt's a real thing, and it's prevalent. It's highly prevalent in flight operations, and it's something that we need to address. So reason number 3 is that we had this group that got no sleep at all, these poor souls. By the way, when you do human subjects research, you have to have your protocol vetted and reviewed by an independent ethics committee, because they don't want you harming and torturing human subjects. Seems reasonable. What we know now, when this study was done, this protocol was approved, but what we know now is that total sleep deprivation of this level, 3 days without sleep, causes permanent, irreparable damage to the brain. That's not to say that these people are in a vegetative state. It just means that having too much alcohol causes permanent, irreparable damage to the brain. And our brains are very complex and robust, and we can sustain a lot of these incidents over the course of our lives. But the point is that this isn't good for you, and so much so that it would highly likely not be approved in this day and age, given what we know now about that, to sleep deprive people to that level. And so this data that condition will probably never be repeated by any scientist. So the data becomes very valuable because we have it. By the way, we also do a lot of stress research, documenting and measuring the human response to stress. And that's tricky because if your intent is to document the human response to stress, and it's unethical to torture and stress people, how do you do an experiment? And this is an aside, by the way. One of the interesting things is one mode that ethics committees deem appropriate for a human experiment is we create a paradigm where people volunteer to be in a scientific study. We're saying we're studying human physiological response. And you can make $50 to participate in this experiment. It only takes a couple of hours. And they sign up to say, sure, that sounds like something I'm interested in. They say, great, here's a copy of the Gettysburg Address. Take 15 minutes to memorize it. And through that door is an auditorium with 2,500 people, and you're going to deliver that in 15 minutes. And we have them all wired up, and they freak out. And we measure the human response to that stress, the stress of public speaking. And it's a very good experimental paradigm because it's very real to those people, and yet somehow the ethics committee thinks that this trick is a reasonable thing to do for the sake of science. In any case, so we have this very valuable condition of people who didn't get any sleep. And we got to compare what they look like when you get no sleep at all to getting some sleep, just not enough sleep. And so when you have a sleep debt, if you need 8 hours for sleep, and you get 6, that's a deficit of 2. If you go 2 days in a row, that's a deficit of a debt of 4. If you go 3 days, it's a debt of 6, and that sleep debt keeps accumulating. But we get to compare it to these folks who get no sleep at all, and what we find is after a week of getting 6 hours of sleep, you're as bad as someone who's been awake between 24 and 40 hours. That is, when you go a week with inadequate sleep, you're as bad as someone who's been up all night. And what's amazing, when we do self-report measures, when we collect self-report measures, asking people how tired they are, these people right here, after a whole day and a whole night and into the second day of being awake, when we ask them how tired they are, they say they're very tired. They rate very highly on these scales. But when we ask these folks who have gone a week at 6 hours how they feel, they don't report the same level of sleepiness. It's much lower. That is, even though when you measure them with objective, accurate, sensitive scientific measures, they're equally impaired. They're the same level of impairment. The people who got there through chronic partial sleep deprivation every day, just a little bit of sleep deprivation, they're unaware of their own deficit. They grossly underestimate the degree of their impairment. And it's, I think of the frogs in the pot. If you drop a frog in I've never done this, by the way. If you drop a pot in a boiling water, it jumps out, but if you slowly heat it, it doesn't, and you can bring the water to a boil. That's what's happening in the sleep debt group. That is, our brains are saying, how do I feel? Well, I kind of feel like I felt yesterday. Well, I guess that's normal. And your perceptions are acclimatizing to the situation, but the absolute level of your deficit is very high. You're just not aware of it. And so what we need objective tools, because if we can't trust ourselves to figure this out, we need tools to check ourselves. This is an experiment that was specifically looking at naps. And I'm not showing it for that reason. I'm showing it for another reason. There was a surprise in this experiment. Sometimes scientists find things deliberately, and sometimes they find things by accident. And there's two things we found in this study. One was deliberate, and the more interesting thing we found by accident. The first is, we wanted to understand, if you can't get all the sleep you need at night or in a single consolidated period, can you have a nap? And is that better or worse than getting all of that, the same amount of sleep in one go? That is getting 8 hours of sleep in a single consolidated period the same as getting 6 plus a 2-hour nap later in the day, or 5 and 3, or whatever combination you can come to? What is breaking your sleep up into parts? Is it bad for the recovery, or is it good, or is it better? We didn't know. And so we did an experiment very similar to the one I just described. And in this experiment, we had 18 different conditions, and they were all different combinations of primary sleep period augmented with a nap. And you see these complicated plots. Don't worry too much about the complexity. these complicated plots, they show that the primary sleep period along here in its tiny little numbers. This says 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then here's naps, and it's half hour, hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, etc. And so if you look at each dot, you have to cross so 7.2 plus a half an hour nap, that's this dot here, and you get the point. Every group is represented on that surface map. And this is at 8 a.m. And if we look, these are the folks getting 8 hours, up is bad. These are the folks getting 8 hours of sleep. And way in the back corner, those are the persons getting 4 hours of sleep. And there's a big separation between those two groups. That is, the 4-hour people are very impaired, and the 8-hour people are good to go. That makes a lot of sense. 8 a.m., look what happens at 6 p.m. Everyone's fine. That is, I can't tell the difference. After 2 weeks of getting 4 hours of sleep, if I put that person next to someone who's been getting 8, and I use the best, most accurate, sensitive, scientific tools to measure them objectively, I can't tell the difference. How is this even possible? And what we found is, and we know about the circadian rhythm, we know about the biological clock, and we know that we are not a nocturnal species. That is, owls are nocturnal, mice are nocturnal, humans are a daytime species. Everything about our biology is daytime species. If you don't believe me, wait till there's no moon, a dark sky, and go for a walk in the woods at night and tell me what that experience is like. It's incredibly scary. And the reason is our eyes don't work very well at night. That is, we're not meant to be out there at night. But through technology and our modern culture, we are awake at night. And through the invention of jet aircraft, we fly to different time zones, and we're awake during our biological night. And we're working against our biology. Our whole biology is telling us to go to sleep and be sleepy, and here we are trying to be alert and productive. And so we're the only animal that does this. That is, at night, next time you're awake at 2 in the morning, realize that every other daytime species on the planet is asleep right now except for the humans. We're the only one that sort of defies our biology in this manner. So we know about the circadian impacts. And is everyone familiar with the term WACL? Is this a term that's we're familiar with? So WACL is window of circadian low. And it's the period of time between, it's defined differently in different countries, but in the United States it's 2 to 6 a.m. I think in Canada it's going to be 1 to 5 in the new cars. We'll see. But this is the period of time when you're supposed to be asleep, and this is the period of time where we see a lot of alertness deficits and fatigue-related problems. And so we know about that. We know that we see big alertness deficits in the middle of the night. But on the other side of the coin, what makes us a daytime species is this biological clock upregulates us in the late afternoon, 5, 6, 7, 8 p.m. And this is the period of the day where our body's really promoting a lot of alertness in the late afternoon. And you see that here. It's compensating for the lack of sleep in all of the participants in the study. So if this is what the WACL looks like, if this yellow cartoon represents impairment, you start to become impaired more and more and more as you get to about 4 in the morning, and then you get better and better as daytime comes. And you've experienced this many, many times as pilots, where you call it your second wind, or you start to you crash, and I don't mean crash, I mean you have a physiological low point where you think, I'm really struggling, and then an hour later you're like, oh, I'm feeling a little bit better, I'm getting my second wind. What's happening is you've crossed through this WACL and you're coming into this period where it's now coming into the daytime hours biologically. So what does the WACL look like when we have a sleep debt? Two things happen. One is its impact grows. That is, when you have a sleep debt, that WACL hits you harder. And when you have a sleep debt, it's not just 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 or 2 to 6. It's not just those hours in the middle of the night. It starts to hit you earlier, and it lasts longer. So the number of hours across the day that it impacts you grows. So when we plot experimental data against this little cartoon, we see two measures. One is the PVT, the objective measure of alertness, and up is bad. And it starts out really high. So what does this mean? Well, when we don't have a sleep debt, the way our bodies work is this. You sleep all night, you get 8 hours or more of sleep, you recharge your battery, you wake up refreshed and alert. And you go across the day and you sort of grind down. You sort of use your resources across the day and grind down. And you get to the end of the day and you're tired and ready to go to bed to get a good night's sleep. And it's a lot like our mobile phones. We plug our mobile phones in at night, we wake up and they're at 100%, and then we use them all day, and at the end of the day they're at 39%. We plug them in and we recharge them. And that's how our bodies work. When we have a sleep debt, because of this Wackel effect, this interaction, the circadian effect, when you wake up in the morning, even though you just got 7 hours of sleep, because it was inadequate and because you have a sleep debt, I just got 7 hours of sleep, you're at the worst you're going to be all day, first thing in the morning. And each hour that passes, you get better. That is, as you tend toward that 6, 7, 8 p.m. time, where that circadian upregulation's kicking in, you're going to get better and better and better across the day. But your worst performance is in the morning. This is remarkable for a few reasons. One, when we schedule early morning and daytime ops, we don't think about fatigue because it's not, I just rested, I just got 7 hours of sleep. Fatigue's not on my radar right now because it's the beginning of the day. But the American Colleges of Surgeons have so much prestige and power that they're able to self-regulate and they're able to resist government intervention in many cases.
I asked my doctor. I was quite young, new in the maintenance. I'm working at night, and I said to her, I work on machines, and I know 12 to 14 hours in, I'm tired, right? I want to go home. How do you deal with that? And their answer was, that's how it's always done. We did it that way, that's how it's always done.
Absolutely.
So, is it the complacency,
It's arrogance. It's arrogance and it's economics. So medical residents are slave labor. And the cost to the hospital is a fraction of the fully trained physician. And there's a huge economic pressure to exploit that workforce as much as possible. And the residents are the ones that are most, they go through a period where they really are overworked and they're very fatigued. What's interesting is that we developed a program where on a 40-hour work shift, which is a typical work shift for a medical resident, the period between 1 and 5 a.m. you had protected for sleep and you went into a bed and you slept. And the first iteration of that intervention, we said, okay, you have a protected period from 1 to 5 a.m., go and sleep. And we measured their sleep and they got some sleep and it wasn't great sleep. And then we did two things. One is we took away their pager. We had a night float, an additional staff member, a doctor that was hired to be in the hospital to cover the people who were sleeping. We said, your patients are taken care of. If there's an extreme emergency, we'll wake you up. But for 99% of normal stuff, we're not going to wake you up. So go and have a good night's sleep. And the second thing we did, which was critical, was we said, and a human will come and wake you up when it's time. Don't set an alarm and don't fret about sleeping in or not getting up when you're supposed to. A human's going to come and physically shake you, and so you don't have to worry about waking up. And when we did those two things, they got really good sleep, and their performance scores went up, and their alertness scores went up, and it was a really good intervention. And the cost was reasonable to have the night float, and that became regulation, or that became, it's not a regulation, it became the industry accepted practice. And that just got rolled back in the current climate. So that's gone away. And the medical resident program comes from the University of Maryland. And it was an ingenious thing what they did. What they did was they had this insight that disease doesn't just happen 9 to 5. Disease happens 24 hours a day. And actually, some of the more interesting stuff happens in the middle of the night. And the people who know diseases are the spouses of the people who are ill. And the doctors didn't get to see any of that. And so what they did was doctors in training, medical students, came and lived in the hospital. They built hospitals, but they also built residences in the hospital. And you lived there for 6 months or 12 months. You did your residency, and you moved in to the hospital. You lived there among the patients. And if there was a problem, you woke up the doctor. But the doctor was in their home as a resident of the hospital. And it was a brilliant program. And they said, how can we franchise this? How can we make this the model for medical education in this country. And what they did, they said, we'll just come in for 40 hours and do 40-hour work shifts twice a week, and they'll get to see a nice 24-hour plus cycle, which, aside from the fatigue, is a brilliant thing to do, but the fatigue is a major problem. And so enter into the concept of this protected period for sleep, get a nap, and that'll get you through that period. And it was a good idea, and unfortunately the pendulum is, we took a step forward and now we take a step back. But this is an industry where, when a non-punitive, there's estimated 200,000 deaths each year in the United States associated with medical error. A small fraction of them get litigated for malpractice, but estimated 200,000 deaths to medical malpractice. When a non-punitive confidential survey was done where doctors were asked, did you kill a person this year because you made a mistake? And they answered yes. The next question was, do you believe the reason you made a mistake was because you were fatigued? 100,000, the estimate is 100,000 deaths from a mistake made by a physician who was sleep deprived, at least that by their admission.
So was that 50%?
Around 50% of medical errors, the physician, and we didn't ask every single doctor. This is a statistical sample that you project and scale. I had a personal experience where I was speaking to a medical resident anesthesiologist, and she was working the high tempo training shifts and on a 40-hour resident shift, and she had an opportunity to lie down and go to sleep, and she fell asleep, and she was in pain, and physical pain from the fatigue that she was in. And someone came into the ER for open heart surgery, and they said, we need you to wake up, we need you to prep this patient for emergency open heart surgery. And she rolls out of bed, and she's trying to wake up, and she's in physical pain, and 20 minutes later the nurse comes in and says, the patient died. You can go back to sleep. And she said to herself, oh, thank God. And she told me this. She said, I said that to I said, thank God. And then she had this sense of guilt, like how selfish and small she was, that she was thankful that this person had to die so she could get another hour of sleep. Is that the sort of paradigm you want your physician working in? That, boy, I hope this guy dies so I can just go and sleep another hour. And it was an honest thing that she communicated. I was very grateful that she was candid. But that's the status quo, and they've been doing it for 50 years, and it's stupid. The Navy had a pattern of scheduling the watch bill, the shift schedules on submarines and ships. And you're on duty for 6 hours, you're on call for 6 hours, then you have 6 hours for sleep. And then day 2 starts in the 19th hour. And there's a lot of reasons why that's a good idea, but one really big reason it's a bad idea is that we are 24-hour creatures. Our bodies, we have these biological clocks, and we came from Earth, and Earth has a 24-hour light-dark cycle, and over the million years that we've lived here, we developed a biology that anticipates the sun. And our bodies are 24-hour bodies. If we move to Saturn or Mars or wherever, we're going to have a problem because we're not from there, and we're always going to be 24-hour creatures. So when you join the Navy and they say, now you're an 18-hour creature, that is, we want you to have cycles, biological cycles that are timed on an 18-hour day, and you can't do it. You live on your 24-hour day. So in the Navy, on the watch bill, you're in constant jet lag. And they've been doing it for 50 years. And that was the reason for not changing, despite the overwhelming evidence. And we worked with the Navy for over 10 years, and not just us, but other groups have been working on this. And last year, the Navy changed from the 18-hour watch bill to 24-hour. And so in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence, you can get organizations to change, and it's not easy. Another example of in the face of overwhelming evidence is the metric system. So the metric system, the case for change in the U.S., changing over to the metric system is overwhelming. But despite that, they're not ready yet. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. But this is an example where sometimes there's no single reason why to not switch except for status quo, and that's a powerful force. And that's what we're dealing with here. Okay. So I'll get through this one real quick because I want to move on to the sort of next chapter. How are we doing for time here? Okay, we're not doing so good. I'll skip this one. I'll give this to you in one sentence. Being fatigued is like being drunk. Even without a sleep debt, after being awake for 21 hours and coming into your WACL, that nighttime period, your 0.08 blood alcohol level, the comparable alertness deficits. So not only is fatigue prevalent, but the magnitude of the deficit is very significant. And I often think getting on the airplane, if the pilots are doing their pre-flight procedures, I check in on them, the door's open, I check in, make sure everything's in order. And I think, wouldn't it be funny if they were having a glass of wine, just relaxing before their flight? It'd be on the front page of the paper, it'd be a scandal, they'd be fired. And why is that? Because we kind of know that having alcohol and flying isn't a good idea, and definitely being 0.08 blood alcohol concentration drunk and flying is a terrible idea. But when you get on that plane, those pilots, if they're at that level of fatigue, it's invisible. And it's even somehow a sign of professionalism that I showed up for work today, even though I'm not at my best and I didn't get a good night's sleep. It's actually something that there's a subtle sort of badge of honor associated with it. Okay, so we talked about the PVT. What makes the PVT special? No learning effects, no aptitude differences. So we have all these cognitive tests. There's a zillion of them. And they're measuring different things of our cognition. And they all suffer from two things. Aptitude differences, that is, smarter people do better on them. And practice effects. The more you do the test, the better you get at it. This one doesn't have those features. It's so simple and stupid that a 6-year-old could do it. And when you're alert, it's very, very simple to do. But when you're in a deficit state, it exposes that deficit. It's the equivalent of the patella reflex. You know, that you go to the doctor on your physical and they strike your knee and you have that reflex. It would be like saying, hey, Bob, we're going out after work today. Would you like to join us? And Bob says, no, I have my physical tomorrow. I'm going to practice my patella reflex. I really want to do well tomorrow on my physical. Bob's a moron. That is, no amount of practice is going to help Bob on that patella reflex test. And in the same way, no amount of practice helps you on the PVT. And so that's what makes it such a valuable measure. Okay, so let's look at the fatigue meter. This is a tool that we developed and is used to quantify fatigue in a flight operation. And the way it works is you take your flight schedules and you run it through the tool. And so now it knows when you're on duty and when you're working. And the other time is the time you have available for the rest of your life, including sleep. We make an estimate on when people are going to go to bed, how long they're going to sleep, and when they're going to wake up. And based on this, we then model the biology and we estimate, we give every hour on duty a fatigue score, a score from 1 to 20. It can go higher than 20, but we don't see scores higher than 20. So every hour on duty gets a fatigue score, and then we're most interested in top of descent. What is your score going to be at top of descent? And we rate that trip, and we put it on this scale. So fatigue's worse this way, and this is the number of trips this is a flight department with 3 people over a month, and each trip is one of these Lego blocks. And so you see that 95% of the trips happen between 0 and 8. That's the 0 to 8 is good to go. No real concern about fatigue. And you see, it's almost all in there. That is, fatigue's not a problem every flight, every time. Most of the time we're within our coping capability. But then you see some fatigue out in the 9s, and we see fatigue out in 12s and 13s, international trips. These are the ones you want to mitigate. But this is the gift. So if you say, my organization, we're going to adopt fatigue risk management. When the very first group we did this with was Delta Airlines, and their big concern was, we're afraid of what we're going to find. What if we find that we have a major fatigue problem, and then once we know we have a major fatigue problem, we have to do something about it, and what if it makes us uncompetitive? What we found was 95 to 99% of their operation was nominal, was good to go. It was 1%, 1 out of 100 flights, 1 out of 20 flights, somewhere in that range. But few and far between, and they just needed some surgical intervention. With a little bit of an adjustment, you could make that trip good too. So the real gift is that this isn't pervasive. This is hot spots that we have to surgically identify and intervene, and the interventions are reasonable. So once you find a trip that's a problem, you say, well, what's a problem about this trip? And you click on it, and it brings up the trip. So the way this plot works is this is your flight duty period. This is estimated sleep. Up here is the actual trip. And then this line is fatigue. So up is bad. And you see fatigue's going up, you sleep, it gets better, fatigue's going up. And then you sleep, it gets better. And then you have this day here where you wake up at 8 in the morning, but your trip doesn't start till 10 p.m., but you're awake all day. And then you start flying, and fatigue's going up, and then you have a layover. It's a short trip, and you have a layover in the middle of the night, and then another segment. But this is the problem right here. It's this trip, and it's top of descent here. So in a month of flying, there are 1 or 2 trips that have this. And so what do? You say, well, let's get a hotel, and let's give and here I put the nap here, but I would actually put the nap here if it was possible, logistically. And that brings the fatigue down, and then you've mitigated the fatigue risk. That is, with fatigue, we can compensate a lot. That is, low fatigue's good, medium fatigue's not a big problem, even moderate and moderately high fatigue, we can still cope with that. We're starting to feel tired, we may not be at our best, but we're still going to deliver. It's when we go past that point where we can no longer cope and we start to have unreliable performance. That's what we want to get rid of. That's what we're trying to address here.
For that flight, can you have a power nap? What's the ideal power nap?
So power nap is just a word we gave people so that they didn't feel lazy when they did it.
Yeah.
It's just a nap. But we said, well, make it a power nap, and then, busy executives. Okay. We just gave it a name so it would be more palatable in operational environments. My position is, I hear pilots are obsessed with REM sleep. We want to know about REM sleep. We got to get our REM sleep. Don't worry about any of that. More sleep is better, unless it's going to disrupt your next sleep period. So if you're taking a nap, but in an hour or two you're going to be having your primary sleep period, you probably want to limit the amount of time so that you don't have insomnia because you just had a nap. But notwithstanding that, a nap of 20 minutes has restorative benefits. Longer naps, you'll go deeper into sleep, which is a good thing from a recovery perspective, but you're going to experience sleep inertia. When you wake up, you're going to be groggy. And that grogginess takes about 30 minutes to dissipate, so you have to account for that for naps that occur during the wackle or longer naps. So that's the only caveat with naps. But I say sleep as much as you want. Try and make it so that it doesn't disrupt your next sleep period. But a 20-minute nap would solve this. A 20-minute nap gets you through your current situation, and then you live for another day and you make a plan for the next day. So that's sort of my advice on napping. I have about 31 more slides. We're not going to make it. I propose we wrap it up here, and do we have time for a question or two?
Is there any Q&A from anybody?
How long does it take to recover? You say 6 days, 6 hours of sleep, one night. Basically, you've lost a full night's rest. How long does it take to recover?
It's a good question. This is the question that's at the cusp of where we are as a scientific community. Operationally, the answer is 2 or 3 days. Let's assume that's the answer, but it's not. But let's assume that 1, 2, or 3 good days of 8+ hours of sleep, and you're reset. The truth of the matter is there's 2 answers. One is it takes much longer, but we're talking about full recovery. You might get to 97.7% in 1 or 2 or 3 days, and just that small tail could take a long time. The second is you never recover. That is, if I were to ask you, when I was in college, I didn't eat any broccoli. I didn't eat anything green. How much broccoli do I have to eat today to make up for that? And the answer is, there's no making up for it. It's water under the bridge. That's now time-stamped in your experience on this planet, and it's going to affect your long-term and future health. Everything you do impacts the future of you. And so you never really recover, but you do, and practically speaking, 2 or 3 days is the operational answer.
Thank you. A question: if 8 hours of sleep is ideal, and you're shifting your 8 hours of sleep back in time, which bites you more, the circadian rhythm and that what do we call the AWAR curve?
WACL, window of circadian low.
Is that curve going to hit you more, or will the if you have 8 hours of sleep, you've got your 8 hours of sleep, but that may be at a low point in that curve, or the high point in that curve where you're most impaired. Does the circadian rhythm still hit you no matter how?
It still hits you no matter what. So we identify 3 factors that will generate alertness deficits.
You're not changing the circadian rhythm.
The circadian rhythm can shift.
Okay.
And it's slow. The rule of thumb is it can shift approximately 1 time zone per day. So if you fly to Europe and it's a 6-hour or 7-hour time zone shift, I think it's 6 from, it will take approximately 6 days to fully acclimatize to local time there. However, so sleep deprivation can come in 3 modes or alertness deficits. One is not getting enough sleep on a daily basis, sleep debt. The second is you're awake during your WACL. And the third is you've been awake longer than 16 hours. Now, any one of those factors will produce deficits. Any 2 will work in combination. And when all 3 are present, it's 1 plus 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 3, it equals 7. There's a big a multiplying effect to having more than one factor present. But each one has their own contribution to deficits.
One more.
Could you go back 1 slide? Oh, I was looking for the diagram from the Van Bugen diagram.
Which one?
The one that shows the days awake or hours of sleep, that one on the bottom right. Nope, sorry, go back.
Here, this is the one you want, right?
Yes,
Okay.
that one. So what I found was several things about that I found fascinating, but one of them is the bottom line is the 8 hours of sleep. It's still showing an increase in sleep debt.
Correct.
Which I mean, we've said 8 hours is what you need, but
Right.
when I look at that, that is not what I see.
Okay, so we can explain this. So one is the average in the population is 8 hours, which means roughly half of people need more than 8 hours. Some people need 8 hours and 40 minutes. Some people need more. We were giving them 8 hours time in bed.
Right.
Another thing is that 8 hours time in bed doesn't mean 8 hours of sleep. So these people are probably getting 7:40, maybe 7:35, and some of them need 8.5. So half of the people in this group are actually have mild sleep deprivation. I'll also say that everything under 6 is good to go. So even after 2 weeks, there's still, everyone here is saying, I feel fine, I feel rested, I feel alert. 6 and under is good to go, and they don't ever go anywhere out of that zone. So there is, you're detecting a mild accumulation. And if we repeated this experiment, we would give them 9 hours in this group. And we didn't know at the time, and that was the best estimate of what people needed to be fully rested. And so it's an astute observation, and but everyone here is rested and alert, and they would say so. Okay. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you.